Welcome to the Life Paradox, where reality is stranger than fiction. Morgan Ellis had spent the last 3 weeks planning her mother's 60th birthday party in secret. The details consumed her: guest lists scrawled on sticky notes hidden in her desk drawer, late-night Pinterest boards of decorations, hushed, phone calls with the caterer while her mother watched television in the next room. It was the first real celebration they would have since Morgan's father died 2 years ago. Cancer had taken him quickly, leaving both women adrift in an apartment that felt too empty, too quiet. "Your mother needs this," Morgan's aunt had insisted, over the phone. Diana hasn't been herself since Robert passed. Morgan knew this better than anyone. She'd watched her once vibrant mother fade into a routine of work, home, and sleep. No more book club meetings, no more weekend hiking trips, no more impromptu cooking experiments that filled the kitchen with strange and wonderful smells. It was as if Diana Ellis had decided that joy was something she could no longer afford. The guest list grew longer than Morgan had anticipated. Former colleagues from her mother's 30 years as a high school English teacher, neighbors from their old house in the suburbs before they'd downsized to the apartment, friends from college that Diana still exchanged Christmas cards with but hadn't seen in person for years. Every paradox begins with a question. If you love unraveling life's biggest mysteries, hit subscribe and join the Life Paradox, where every story bends reality. Morgan made her invitation calls during lunch breaks at the publishing house, where she worked as an editorial assistant. Many people seemed surprised to hear from her, but delighted at the prospect of celebrating Diana. "Your mother saved my life in high school," one former student told her. "I'd walk through fire for that woman." The venue was a small garden restaurant downtown, with string lights hanging from trellises and a private room that opened onto a patio. Morgan had spent nearly all her savings to book it for a Saturday evening in June, when the weather would be perfect for the outdoor dessert reception she'd planned. 2 days before the party, Morgan came home to find her mother sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in hand, staring at an old photo album. "What are you looking at?" Morgan asked, setting down her grocery bags. Diana smiled softly. "Just remembering when you were small. You and your father used to have these elaborate tea parties with your stuffed animals." Morgan felt her throat tighten. "I remember those. Loved you so much, sweetheart." Diana closed the album. "We both did. We still do. I still do." "I know, Mom. I'm sorry I haven't been very present lately." Morgan sat down across from her mother. "It's okay. We're both still figuring things out." Diana reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. "I have something to tell you, Morgan. Something important." The kitchen suddenly felt too warm. There was something in her mother's tone that made Morgan's stomach clench. "I've been seeing someone," Diana said quietly. "A man I met at my grief support group 6 months ago. His name is Thomas." Morgan felt the room tilt slightly. 6 months? Her mother had been dating someone for half a year and hadn't said a word? "He's asked me to marry him," Diana continued, her eyes fixed on their joined hands. "And I've said yes. The party invitations, the restaurant deposit, the carefully orchestrated surprise. All of it seemed to evaporate as Morgan stared at her. Mother, a stranger with familiar eyes who had apparently been rebuilding her life in secret, just as Morgan had been planning this party in secret. "When?" was all Morgan could manage to ask. "We're thinking August," Diana said. "A small ceremony." Morgan's phone buzzed in her pocket, probably the bakery confirming the cake delivery for Saturday, for a party that now felt completely pointless. Morgan barely slept that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom, now converted into a guest room that still housed her old bookshelf and debate team trophies. The engagement news echoed in her mind, colliding with thoughts of the 60 people who would be arriving at Gardenia's restaurant in 36 hours, expecting to surprise a woman who had just dropped her own bombshell. How could her mother have kept such a significant relationship secret? Morgan had noticed Diana seemed less despondent in recent months. She'd attributed it to time-healing wounds, not to a new romance. She thought about canceling the party, calling everyone with some excuse about her mother being ill. But the non-refundable deposit and the fact that people were traveling from out of town made that impossible. Morning arrived with no solutions. Morgan dragged herself to the kitchen to find Diana humming as she made coffee, looking lighter than she had in years. "I thought we could have dinner with Thomas next week," Diana said. "You'll like him, I think. He teaches physics at the community college. He has grown children too, a son your age and a daughter a bit younger." Morgan nodded mechanically, pouring coffee into a mug that read "World's Best Daughter," a gift from her father on her 16th birthday. "That sounds nice," she managed, though her mind was racing with the implications. A stepfamily, a stepfather, all these new connections when she hadn't even processed losing her father yet. "Are you upset with me?" Diana asked, her smile faltering. "I know it's sudden." "6 months isn't sudden, Mom," Morgan said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "What's sudden is finding out about it yesterday." Diana set down her mug. "I wasn't ready to share him with you yet. This was something I needed for myself first." The word stung. For 2 years, Morgan had carefully monitored her grief, making sure it never overshadowed her mother's. She'd been the one arranging meals with friends, managing the insurance paperwork, selling the house when the memories became too painful. She'd put her own life on hold, pausing a promising relationship, turning down a promotion that would have required more travel, to be present for her mother. "I have to get to work," Morgan said, though it was Saturday and she had taken the day off to prepare for the party. She grabbed her keys and phone, leaving her coffee untouched on the counter. In her car, Morgan called her best friend, Leah. "She's engaged," Morgan said without preamble. "To some man I've never even heard of. Before yesterday." "What?" Leah's voice crackled through the speakers. "Your mom? Diana?" Apparently they met in grief counseling. They've been dating for 6 months. "And the party is still on for tonight?" Morgan groaned, resting her forehead against the steering wheel. "What choice do I have? People are coming from 3 different states." There was a pause before Leah spoke again. "Look at it this way. Now it's a double celebration, birthday and engagement." But it wasn't that simple. The party was supposed to remind her mother of all the connections she still had, all the people who loved her. It wasn't supposed to be an introduction to Diana's new life, a life she'd deliberately kept Morgan out of. Morgan drove to the restaurant to check on the final arrangements. The manager showed her the private dining room, where staff were already arranging tables with cream-colored linens and small vases of wildflowers. "It's going to be beautiful," the manager assured her. "Your mother will be so touched." Morgan nodded, trying to imagine her mother's reaction when she walked in to find 60 familiar faces and realized her daughter had been keeping secrets too. Would she be angry? Would she see it as an intrusion rather than a gift? As Morgan left the restaurant, her phone rang. It was her Aunt Caroline, Diana's sister. "How are you holding up?" Caroline asked. "Diana called me this morning about Thomas." "You knew about him?" Morgan couldn't keep the hurt from her voice. "Only for a couple of weeks," Caroline admitted. "Your mother swore me to secrecy until she could tell you herself." Morgan felt the betrayal deepen. Even her aunt had been brought into the confidence before her. "The party is still happening," Morgan said flatly. 8 o'clock. Don't be late." At 6 o'clock, Morgan arrived home with the pretext of taking her mother to a casual birthday dinner, just the 2 of us. Diana was dressed in a simple blue wrap dress that Morgan had never seen before. She looked younger somehow, her hair freshly styled, a touch of makeup bringing color to her face. "You look nice," Morgan said, trying to keep her tone neutral despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. "Thank you, sweetheart." Diana smiled, reaching for her purse. "I thought we..." Could invite Thomas to join us for dessert. He's eager to meet you. Morgan froze. The entire evening was meticulously scheduled. Dinner at 8, cake at 9:30, speeches she had carefully coordinated with her mother's oldest friends. There was no room for Thomas in this plan. Actually, I made reservations at that new place downtown, Morgan improvised. It's pretty exclusive. Just the two of us tonight. You can introduce me to Thomas another time. Diana looked momentarily disappointed, but nodded. Of course. Let me just send him a quick text. In the car, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Morgan had rehearsed a route that would take them past her mother's favorite spots in the city, giving people time to arrive at the restaurant before them. Now the drive felt interminable. I'm sorry I didn't tell you about Thomas sooner, Diana said eventually, gazing out the window at the familiar streets. I was afraid you wouldn't understand. That you're moving on? Morgan kept her eyes fixed on the road. I'm not a child, Mom. I want you to be happy. It's not that simple, Diana sighed. When I met Thomas, it felt like a betrayal to your father, to his memory, to you. I needed time to reconcile those feelings before I could share them. Morgan turned onto the avenue that led downtown, lined with flowering cherry trees her father had always admired in spring. Dad wouldn't want you to be alone forever. I know, Diana said softly. Thomas says the same thing about his late wife. The mention of this unknown man's opinion on her father's wishes made Morgan grip the steering wheel tighter. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Leah. Everyone's here. The place looks amazing. Who's that? Diana asked. Just work, Morgan lied, her heart racing as they approached the restaurant. The valet was waiting as arranged, and Morgan pulled up to the curb. This is fancy for just the two of us, Diana commented as they walked toward the entrance. Morgan took a deep breath. Well, it is a special occasion. She pushed open the door to the private room, and 60 voices shouted, Surprise! In unison. Diana gasped, one hand flying to her mouth, the other instinctively grabbing Morgan's arm for support. The room was filled with familiar faces, teachers Diana had worked with for decades, neighbors from their old street, cousins who had flown in from Colorado. A banner reading, Happy 60th Birthday, Diana, stretched across one wall, and a table of photographs chronicling her life stood near the entrance. For one terrible moment, Morgan thought her mother might be angry or overwhelmed. Then Diana began to laugh. A real laugh, the kind Morgan hadn't heard since before her father got sick. You did all this? Diana turned to her daughter, eyes shining with tears. Morgan nodded, suddenly unable to speak as relief flooded through her. Diana pulled her into a tight hug. My brilliant, sneaky girl, no wonder you've been so distracted lately. As Diana moved into the crowd, accepting hugs and exclamations of birthday wishes, Morgan felt her phone vibrate again. A text from an unknown number. Diana told me about your surprise party. She's lucky to have a daughter like you. Looking forward to meeting you someday soon. Thomas. Morgan stared at the message, a complicated mix of emotions churning inside her. Her mother had told this man about the party, almost immediately, even as she was telling Morgan she couldn't join them tonight. They were already sharing these kinds of details, already a unit in ways Morgan hadn't fully processed yet. Across the room, Diana caught her eye and smiled radiantly, mouthing, "Thank you," before being pulled into another embrace by a former colleague. Despite everything, Morgan couldn't help but smile back. Her mother looked happy, truly happy, for the first time in years. Perhaps that had been the point of this party all along. The evening progressed like a carefully orchestrated dance. Morgan moved among the guests, refilling wine glasses and directing servers with trays of appetizers. She kept one eye on her mother, who seemed to glow under the attention, laughing, with old friends and accepting birthday wishes with graceful delight. Near the bar, Morgan overheard snippets of conversation. "Diana looks wonderful," said Mrs. Chen, who had taught science in the classroom next to her mother's for 20 years. "There's something different about her." "She's in love," replied another teacher, whose name Morgan couldn't recall. "Did you hear? She's engaged to some professor she met in her support group." Morgan nearly dropped the tray she was carrying. The news was already circulating. She hadn't considered that her mother might have told others before the party. The revelation she thought was hers alone to process was apparently common knowledge. When Morgan approached the small knot of teachers, they fell silent, offering tight smiles. "The party is lovely," Mrs. Chen said, patting Morgan's arm. "Your father would be so proud of you for doing this." Before Morgan could respond, the restaurant manager appeared at her elbow. "There's a gentleman at the front asking for Diana Ellis. He says he's her fiancé." The room seemed to tilt. "Tell him," Morgan began, not sure what to say. "It's fine," a familiar voice interrupted. Her mother had appeared beside them, cheeks flushed from laughter and wine. "I invited him. I hope—" "That's all right, sweetheart. I wanted the two most important people in my life to meet tonight." Without waiting for Morgan's response, Diana moved toward the entrance, leaving her daughter standing frozen among guests who seemed to know more about her mother's life than she did. Leah materialized at Morgan's side. "Breathe," she advised. "This isn't about you." "Isn't it?" Morgan whispered, watching as her mother returned, arm in arm with a tall man with silver hair and kind eyes. "I planned this whole night to help her reconnect with her past, and she's using it to introduce her future." "Maybe that's exactly what she needs," Leah suggested. Morgan watched as Diana led Thomas around the room, introducing him to longtime friends and family members. He seemed genuinely interested in each person, listening intently to stories about Diana's past, laughing at the right moments. He kept one hand lightly on Diana's back, a gesture of support rather than possession. When they finally made their way to where Morgan stood, Diana's eyes were bright with nervous anticipation. "Morgan, this is Thomas Whitaker. Thomas, my daughter Morgan." Thomas extended his hand. "I've heard so much about you. Diana tells me you're quite the literary talent at your publishing house." Morgan shook his hand automatically, surprised by the firm warmth of his grip. "Nice to meet you," she managed. Up close, she could see he was probably in his mid-60s, with laugh lines around his eyes and a slightly crooked nose that suggested it had been broken once. "I hope I'm not intruding," Thomas said, seeming to understand the complexity of the moment. "Diana insisted I should be here to meet everyone at once, but I can certainly make myself scarce if you'd prefer this to be just about her birthday." Before Morgan could formulate a response, her Aunt Caroline appeared with a tray of champagne flutes. "Perfect timing for a toast," Caroline declared, distributing glasses. She handed one to Thomas with a warm smile. "Welcome to the family chaos," and Caroline clinked her glass to get everyone's attention. Morgan felt a surge of resentment. This was supposed to be her event, her gift to her mother. Now it had somehow transformed into an engagement party without her consent. But as she looked at her mother's face, relaxed and joyful in a way it hadn't been for years, Morgan felt her anger begin to dissolve. Perhaps this night was still exactly what her mother needed, just not in the way Morgan had envisioned. When the cake arrived, a towering confection with fresh berries and Happy 60th Diana written in elegant script, Morgan found herself standing next to Thomas at the dessert table. The other guests had formed a semicircle, cameras ready as Diana prepared to blow out the candles. "She hates being the center of attention," Morgan commented, surprising herself by initiating conversation with him. Thomas nodded. "She told me she was terrified of public speaking when she first started teaching. Hard to believe seeing her now." The observation was so accurate that Morgan glanced at him sharply. "How much has she told you about herself?" Thomas considered the question carefully before answering. "Quite a lot, I think. About her childhood in Michigan, Her years teaching, how she met your father at a book signing. He paused. And about losing him. How devastating that was for both of you. Morgan swallowed hard, watching as someone handed her mother a knife to cut the cake. She doesn't talk about Dad with me anymore. It's like she's closed that door. She talks about him all the time, actually, Thomas said quietly. About how he could fix anything in the house but couldn't cook to save his life. How he read poetry to her when she couldn't sleep. How he taught you to drive in that old station wagon even though it terrified him. Tears pricked at Morgan's eyes. These were the stories she'd been longing to share. Memories she'd been afraid would fade if never spoken aloud. Why would she tell you but not me? The question came out more plaintively than Morgan intended. Thomas turned to face her fully. Because with me, she's not afraid of causing you more pain. She's protecting you, Morgan. Possibly too much, but that's what parents do sometimes. Across the room, Diana caught their exchange, and her smile faltered slightly, concern crossing her features. Morgan gave a small nod, hoping to reassure her mother that everything was fine. As plates of cake circulated, Morgan found herself cornered by her mother's oldest friend, Helen, who had known Diana since college. "This Thomas seems lovely," Helen said, watching as he chatted easily with Diana's cousins. "And Diana deserves some happiness after everything she's been through." "Of course she does," Morgan agreed automatically. Helen tilted her head, studying Morgan's face. "You know, when your father died, I worried about both of you, but especially Diana. They had the kind of marriage most people only dream about." "I know," Morgan said, feeling defensive. "That's why this seems so soon," Helen supplied. "Maybe by some arbitrary standard, but at our age, you realize time isn't something to waste." She squeezed Morgan's arm gently. "Your father would want this for her. He told her so." Morgan stared at her. "What do you mean?" Helen looked surprised. "Diana never told you?" Robert made her promise she wouldn't spend the rest of her life alone. They had that conversation several times during his last months. He was very adamant about it. The revelation hit Morgan like a physical blow. All this time, she'd been safeguarding her father's memory, assuming her mother was doing the same. But he had given Diana explicit permission, no encouragement, to find love again. Morgan scanned the room for her mother, suddenly desperate to speak with her. She found Diana and Thomas standing near the photographs Morgan had arranged, snapshots of Diana's childhood, her wedding day, holding newborn Morgan, family vacations, retirement parties. As Morgan approached, she heard Thomas ask, "Who took this one? It's beautiful." They were looking at a photograph of Diana laughing on a beach at sunset, her hair windblown, wrapped in a sweater too large for her frame. Her father's sweater. Morgan had taken that photo during their last family vacation, 6 months before. Her father's diagnosis. "Morgan did," Diana said softly, meeting her daughter's eyes as she joined them. "She has her father's eye for capturing moments." For the first time that evening, Morgan felt the tension in her chest begin to unravel. Perhaps there was room in their lives for both the past and the future, for memories of her father and the possibility of new connections. Perhaps she had underestimated her mother's capacity to hold both love stories in her heart without diminishing either. As the evening wound down, guests began to depart in 2s and 3s, hugging Diana and promising to keep in better touch. Morgan found herself collecting abandoned wine glasses and plates, more for something to do than out of necessity. "Let me help," Thomas said, appearing beside her with a stack of dessert plates. Morgan was about to refuse when she noticed her mother watching them from across the room, a hopeful expression on her face. "Thanks," she said instead, leading him toward the kitchen area where the caterers had set up. They worked in silence for a few moments, falling into an unexpectedly comfortable rhythm of gathering and stacking. "Diana tells me you're working on a novel," Thomas said eventually. Morgan nearly dropped the glasses she was carrying. She told you about that? Her unfinished manuscript was saved on her laptop under a password-protected file. She'd shared bits of it with Leah and mentioned it occasionally to her mother. But Diana had never shown much interest beyond polite inquiries about her progress. She's very proud of you, Thomas continued. Says you have a unique voice, though she admitted she had to look up what magical realism meant when she described your style to me. Morgan set down the glasses, trying to process this new information. She's read my work. The pages you left printed in the guest room last Christmas, Thomas confirmed. She hoped you wouldn't mind. A memory surfaced, Morgan working late into the night during her holiday visit, leaving a chapter on the desk when she went to make tea, returning to find the pages slightly rearranged. She'd assumed her mother had merely moved them while tidying. She never said anything, Morgan murmured. She was afraid you might think she was intruding. She said you're very private about your writing. Morgan was. She'd been that way since high school, when her father had enthusiastically shared her prize-winning essay with everyone he knew, causing her weeks of embarrassment despite his good intentions. After that, she'd kept her work closely guarded, showing it only when it felt ready. I have something for you, Thomas said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. Diana thought tonight might be too overwhelming for this, but I disagree. Morgan accepted the package cautiously. It was heavy for its size, no larger than her palm. Open it, Thomas encouraged. She unwrapped the paper to find a brass compass, antique and slightly tarnished, but still beautiful. The needle swung gently before settling north. It was your father's, Thomas explained. Diana found it when they were packing to move from the house. She thought you might like to have it. Morgan ran her finger over the cool metal surface, remembering how her father had taught her to navigate using landmarks and this very compass during their camping trips. Why are you giving this to me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I want you to know I'm not trying to replace him, Thomas said simply. I could never do that, nor would I want to. Robert Ellis will always be your father, and he will always be Diana's first love. I'm just hoping there might be room in both your lives for someone new as well. Morgan closed her fingers around the compass, feeling its weight. The weight of her father's memory, of her mother's future, of her own reluctance to let either change. From the doorway came her mother's voice. Everything okay in here? Morgan turned to find Diana watching them. Anxiously, hands clasped together as if in prayer. Thomas gave me Dad's compass, Morgan said, opening her palm to show her mother. Diana's eyes filled with tears. I should have given it to you myself. I just couldn't find the right moment. The three of them stood in the restaurant kitchen, surrounded by the remains of the party, a triangle of past, present, and future converging in unexpected ways. I have an idea, Morgan said suddenly. Since we're all here and most of the guests are gone. Mom, why don't you tell me about Thomas? How you met, when you knew it was serious, all of it. Diana's expression shifted from anxiety to cautious hope. Really? You want to hear about that? Morgan nodded, pulling out a chair at a nearby table. I want to know the whole story. As Diana began to speak, with Thomas occasionally adding details, from his perspective, Morgan realized she was witnessing something rare. The beginning of a love story that she was now becoming part of, rather than simply observing from a distance. And for the first time since her father's death, that didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like a continuation of a family narrative that had taken an unexpected turn but hadn't ended. 3 weeks after the party, Morgan sat in her apartment, surrounded by thank you notes she was addressing to guests who had traveled to celebrate her mother. The compass her father had owned, now hers, sat on the table beside her, its needle pointing steadily north despite the passing of time and the changing of hands. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Thomas and I are thinking August 15th for the wedding. Small ceremony, just family and close friends. Would you be my maid of honor? Morgan stared at the message, remembering how, as a little girl, she had dreamed of being her mother's maid of honor someday, if her father ever decided they should renew their vows. This wasn't what she had imagined then, but as she'd learned in the weeks since the party, reality rarely conformed to imagination. "I'd be honored," she typed back, surprised to find she meant it. Another text followed quickly. "And we have an idea we'd like to discuss with you. Dinner tonight?" Morgan found herself seated at her mother's dining table that evening, across from Diana and Thomas, who seemed unusually nervous for two people who had just secured their wedding plans. "We have a proposition," Diana began after they finished their meal. "Or rather, Thomas does." Thomas cleared his throat. "As you know, I own a small lake house up north. It's been in my family for generations." Morgan nodded. Her mother had mentioned this property, a rustic cabin on a secluded lake where Thomas spent most summer weekends fishing and reading. "I've decided to give it to my son, Andrew," Thomas continued. "But before I do, Diana and I thought we might use it for something special." He looked at her mother, who gave him an encouraging nod. "We'd like to offer it to you for 6 months," he said, turning back to Morgan. "As a place to finish your novel." Morgan set down her wine glass, certain she'd misheard. "What?" 6 months, Diana repeated. "No rent, no interruptions, just you and your manuscript and the lake." "But my job, my apartment—" "You've been saying for years that you'd write full-time if you could afford to," Diana pointed out. "You have enough savings to cover your apartment for 6 months if you're not spending money on anything else. And your editor said you could work remotely on a contract basis, didn't she?" It was true. Morgan's publishing house had been moving toward more flexible work arrangements, and her supervisor had hinted that remote editing was possible for senior staff like Morgan. "This is too much," Morgan protested, but Thomas shook his head. "It's a cabin that sits empty most of the year," he said, "and it would give me great joy to know it's being used by someone who would appreciate its quiet." Morgan looked at her mother, expecting to see the same eagerness she'd heard in Diana's voice. Instead, she saw something more complex, hope mingled with sadness. "You want me to go away?" Morgan realized suddenly. "So you two can start your life together without me hovering." Diana reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "No, sweetheart. We want to give you the gift your father always wanted for you, time and space to create. He was so proud of your writing, even when you wouldn't let him read it." "He read it anyway," Morgan admitted. "I found drafts in his desk after he died, with notes in the margins." Diana's eyes widened. "He never told me that." "He said it was our secret." Morgan smiled at the memory. "He didn't want to make me self-conscious, but he couldn't resist reading anything I wrote." The three of them sat in silence for a moment, the presence of Robert Ellis palpable in the room despite his absence. Not for the first time, Morgan wondered what advice her father would give her now, faced with this unexpected opportunity and the changes it represented. "I think," she said slowly, "Dad would tell me to take the cabin." Diana smiled, tears gathering in her eyes. "He would. He absolutely would." Thomas raised his glass. "To new beginnings, then. For all of us." 6 weeks later, Morgan stood on the dock of the lake house, watching the sun set over water so still it seemed like glass. Her laptop and printer were set up on a desk near the window inside the cabin. Her novel, nearly finished now, was taking shape in ways she hadn't anticipated when she first arrived. Her phone rang, her mother checking in, as she did every Sunday. "How's the writing?" Diana asked after they'd exchanged greetings. "Good. Really good, actually." Morgan watched a heron glide across the lake, its reflection perfect on the water's surface. "I think I've figured out how to end it." "That's wonderful," Diana said. "Thomas and I were thinking of driving up next weekend. If that wouldn't disrupt your flow, we could stay in town if you prefer. A month ago, Morgan might have made excuses to preserve her solitude. Now, she found herself saying, I'd like that. I could show you what I've been working on. The surprise in her mother's voice was evident. You'd let me read it? Yes, Morgan said, realizing she meant it. Both of you if you want. As they said their goodbyes, Morgan continued watching the heron, which had now landed on a fallen log near the shore. The bird stood perfectly still, patient and attentive, waiting for the right moment to act. Morgan thought about the party she had planned for her mother, a celebration intended to reconnect Diana with her past. Instead, it had become the bridge to a future none of them had expected. Not a replacement for what had been lost, but an addition to the story they were all still writing. She took out her father's compass, watching as the needle swung briefly before finding north once again. Some things remained constant, even as everything around them changed. Her father's love, her mother's strength, and now, unexpectedly, a new connection that didn't diminish the others, but somehow made them more complete. Morgan tucked the compass back into her pocket and headed inside to write the ending of her novel, an ending that, like life itself, would be both surprising and inevitable, both an echo of what had come before and a promise of what might follow.